Now, if we then ask, in the case of a person who becomes a priest, in most of the Western traditions, right, or a monk, right, or a nun, what is at the center of the moral code to which they are dedicating their lives? Again, there are three principles that come to the fore there, particularly in the Catholic tradition, which is the longest of the Christian traditions in existence. When one becomes a priest in that tradition, or a monk or a nun in that tradition, one undergoes a ceremony where one is marrying God or marrying the church. And that ceremony embodies three vows, which are then to be the organizing principles of the rest of one's life. The three vows that a priest will take are a vow of poverty, a vow of obedience, and a vow of chastity or celibacy. Right. Now, the idea here then is that if one is going to be the morally best person, right, one can be, to strive for the ideal, right, according to this moral tradition, necessary is a commitment to and a principled living by the principle of poverty, the principle of obedience, and the principle of chastity. Now, the principle of poverty then is to say, and this is a stand-in for any sort of attachment to material goods or the money that can be used in exchange for various sorts of material goods. Wealth is not seen, right, as a value. Wealth is an attachment to the physical world, and priests, monks, and nuns, by their commitment, are detaching themselves significantly from the material world. And one symbol of their detachment from things of the physical world is an embrace of poverty, right, as a value. They are detaching themselves from their own will, right, rather than seeing their lives as theirs to live, with their own goals, their own pursuits, right, and so forth. They are to live their lives in accordance with orders from a superior force, the most superior force in this case being God, or God's stand-in, the church. And so one sees oneself as an obedient servant of a will that is more significant and important than one's own. So one gives up one's own self-will to a significant extent. Chastity, of course, focuses on sexual pleasures and romantic attachments, and the idea here again is, since these are profoundly personal pleasures, sexual pleasures and romantic attractions, in order to be the best kind of priest, monk, or nun, one gives up sexual pleasure. And of course, if one is pursuing sexuality or pursuing romance in one's life, that's an enormously time-consuming enterprise. And the argument here is by giving those things up and sacrificing them, one can better serve a more important calling, which is service to God or service to the church or other people here. But what's built into all of these is renunciation, sacrifice, giving up, right? And in giving up things that can bring a large measure of personal fulfillment and satisfaction, right, to one's life in this world. All of these values are importantly coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And again, like the Greco-Roman tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition has been enormously influential, incalculably influential on Western civilization, particularly in the modern world. Okay, now the point I am making by contrasting these two, or putting both of them on the board in contrast to each other, is the earlier point about our living in a hybrid civilization. That is to say, we don't live in a monoculture, and in our hybrid civilization, we are trying to embody two philosophical approaches, and in this case, two ethical approaches that are in fundamental tension, if not outright contradiction, to each other. So if we say, for example, from the American Declaration of Independence perspective, or what that means to the American tradition, the good life, right, as defined in an American tradition, is certainly going to include a significant amount of material wealth, so that one can live in a nice house, send one's kids to good schools, have first-rate medical care, vacations in warm places in the winter, and vacations to beautiful places in the summer, and so forth. So the American dream has built into its conception of the good life a significant amount of material wealth. Now that is in direct contrast, right, to a conception of the good life that says the opposite. that the good life, right, as defined, is one defined by the absence of wealth. And it's only to the extent that one has no wealth and takes no interest in material wealth that one can said to be living the good life in a moral sense here. Going down to the second item on the list here, clearly there's a contrast, if not an outright contradiction, between a position that argues that liberty, the power and capacity to make one's own choices, to choose one's own values and course in life, and a mutual respect for other people's doing the same. Nobody's being fundamentally a servant or slave of other people, and right at the other end of the spectrum, a moral code that places obedience to others or an other as a significant core value. So should one see oneself as obedient, servant of other people, or do you see yourself and all others as autonomous, free individuals? Major moral contract there. And then, of course, in the third one, there's a big difference between an approach to one's life if one makes one's happiness one's birthright and dedicates one's efforts to achieving happiness in one's life. For most people, a major component of happiness is romantic and sexual, to find someone with whom one can have a long-standing happy relationship involving romance, eroticism, and sexuality. And if not one person, a series of significant relationships in one's life in which one achieves sexual and romantic happiness. That, as a conception of the good life, certainly is in direct contrast to a conception of the good life that says no sexual pleasure should be a part of that approach to life. That one is moral to the extent that one forswears and abandons any interest in sexuality, romance, or eroticism. Now, the point of the contrast here then is partly to make that historical point. We do, in many cases in the contemporary United States and in many places in the Western world, admire both priests, monks, and nuns and the Declaration of Independence, which is then to say that we're admiring two moral codes that involve very different values. And then when we turn to all kinds of applied issues, necessarily we're going to run into various sorts of conflicts, debates over what the core values should be. And in some cases, people will be applying values that are coming out of a Greco-Roman tradition to a particular situation, and many other people will be applying values that are coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the debate goes on.